The night had been dazzling. Elegant suits, expensive perfume, champagne that flowed like water. It was the kind of night people would post about for weeks, until it all went silent. The sound that shattered the glamour wasn't a glass clink or a loud cheer. It was a scream, sharp, piercing and full of terror. Everyone froze. Just seconds earlier, Layla had been standing near the third-floor terrace railing in a satin dress that caught the moonlight just right, 8 months pregnant, her hand cradled. Her belly, as if she were protecting a secret she couldn't wait to share. No one saw it coming. One moment she was there, smiling softly to herself. The next, her body spun through the air, limbs flailing, her abdomen leading the fall like her baby was trying to take flight before birth. The music stopped. A crystal flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered. Conversation halted mid-sentence. Then came the sickening thud against the marble below. Gasps rippled through the crowd, quickly replaced by screams. People rushed toward the railing, peering over in disbelief. What they saw drained the color from their faces. Down in the courtyard, Layla's body lay crumpled on the cold stone. Silver fabric soaked in blood that spread slowly like a dying flower. Her lips were parted like she'd tried to say something, but the words had gotten stuck halfway out. Her arms were limp. Her eyes fluttered once, then stillness. Jordan Kincaid, the host, the billionaire, the man everyone came to see, was the first to move. His champagne glass dropped, forgotten. He sprinted outside, pushing through a wave of murmuring guests and flashing cameras. When he reached her, he fell to his knees, his hands trembling as they cupped her face. "Layla, please, stay with me." A man once known for commanding boardrooms now begged like a man with nothing left. "Somebody help us!" someone yelled. "She's pregnant. Call 911." But Jordan couldn't move. He just knelt there, lips trembling, unable to accept what lay before him. His wife, the mother of his child, broken in the courtyard of his own mansion. Paramedics arrived swiftly, parting the crowd like a knife through fabric. Lights flashed, orders barked, but the loudest sound was the silence from above. Slowly, heads turned back toward the balcony. There, standing alone, was a woman in a crimson evening gown. Her expression was blank, no shock, no panic. Just stillness, hands resting on the rail like she was admiring her handiwork. It was Maya, the same woman who'd been seen speaking with Layla moments before. "Didn't they just talk?" someone whispered. Was she the last one with her? The questions spread faster than the panic, but no one had seen it. No push, no struggle, just that scream, just the fall. Jordan looked up. Their eyes met, his filled with disbelief and fury, hers unreadable. But whatever truth lingered in that moment remained trapped in the shadows. Down below, the paramedics were trying to stabilize Layla. One gently placed his hand on her belly, then looked at Jordan. "We need to move. Now. The baby's still got a heartbeat." As the ambulance roared into the distance, Jordan stood motionless, his gaze stuck on the red stain against the white marble. His empire, his success, all meant nothing now. He couldn't stop replaying that instant in his head. Why didn't anyone stop it? Why didn't anyone see it coming? Later that night, Jordan sat alone in his study, staring at a thick manila folder. The private investigator he'd quietly hired weeks earlier had returned a report far worse than he'd imagined. Page after page, the truth about Maya unraveled like a horror story. She wasn't who she claimed to be. The glamorous assistant with a flawless resume. Fabricated. The degrees bought. Offshore accounts flooded with suspicious deposits, old boyfriends who had vanished without a trace. Even her name wasn't real. She'd cycled through at least 4 identities in 5 years. Jordan's head spun as he read the details. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a calculated invasion, and what chilled him most, none of it was recent. Maya had been weaving her way into his life long before Layla ever noticed. She'd watched, learned, mimicked every gesture, every word. She didn't just want him. She wanted Layla's life. Before we continue the story, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us keep making stories like this. Jordan leaned back in his chair, replaying every smile, every touch, every conversation he had with Maya. How had he not seen it? Layla, in her trusting kindness, had welcomed Maya into their circle, never questioning, never suspicious. But while she was organizing charity events and caring for their unborn child, Maya had been plotting. One security camera clip nearly made Jordan drop the folder. It showed Maya late one night copying Layla's signature on a piece of paper. Another showed her trying on Layla's clothes, practicing her voice in the mirror, even duplicating her gentle laugh. Jordan's stomach turned. She hadn't fallen for him. She had targeted them. All of them. Jordan didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every image of Maya that flashed through his mind now came with a twist of nausea. How many times had he shared a dinner table with a woman who studied his wife? Like a blueprint. Who copied her kindness, her voice, her wardrobe, only to erase her from existence? He stared at the footage again. Layla and Maya on the balcony. There was no sound, just the distorted glow of the security feed, but the body language said enough. Layla's hands gestured wildly, anger or fear maybe. Maya stood still, arms crossed, chin slightly tilted like she was amused. And then, just before the screen glitched, Maya reached out, grabbed Layla's wrist, and the screen cut to black. Deliberate, timed, controlled. Like someone wanted to hide what came next, Jordan's chest tightened. The rage in him had a pulse now. It wasn't just about heartbreak anymore, it was war. He knew there were answers buried under layers of lies. He just had to dig deep enough to find them, and as he dug, what he found made the ground shake beneath him. The will. His father's. Will, once clear and ironclad, had been updated just months before his death. The new version didn't mention Layla at all. Maya, however, was named the sole heir, the entire estate, the business, everything. It was like Layla had been wiped from history, and the last person who handled that will? Alan, Jordan's cousin, his right hand in the company, the man who had sworn loyalty for life. Now Jordan wasn't just angry, he was spiraling. He confronted Alan in their private boardroom, the space where they'd once built empires together. The air was icy. "You were working with her," Jordan said, his voice low, venomous. Alan's face didn't flinch. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Jordan snapped, slamming the forged documents onto the table. "You handed her the will. You stood by while she erased my wife's name. You let this happen." Alan's silence said more than words ever could. Jordan's world collapsed, not because of a business scandal, not because of a failed investment, but because the two people he trusted most had been dismantling his life behind his back. The betrayal was personal, intimate. It went deeper than money or reputation. They hadn't just taken his empire, they had tried to rewrite his entire existence, and then came the revelation that crushed what little strength he had left. Maya and Layla weren't strangers. They had history, college roommates, close once, until Maya's fiancé left her for Layla. It was a wound Maya had never healed from. She'd cloaked herself in fake smiles and flawless gowns, but inside, she had burned with one obsession: revenge. Every move she made, every word she whispered into Jordan's ear, it wasn't for love, it was for payback. She didn't want Jordan. She wanted to ruin Layla, to destroy her joy, her future, her marriage, and she had nearly succeeded. But fate had its own plan. Layla survived. She had slipped into a coma, yes, but now she stirred. Her eyes blinked open in a sterile hospital room, the hum of machines surrounding her like a choir of warnings. Her throat was dry, her limbs heavy, but the memory came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. "She said she'd kill my baby," Layla whispered to the nurse, her voice barely audible but packed with dread. The nurse froze, then nodded slowly. "We'll call your doctor." But Layla knew this wasn't about medical charts or blood pressure readings. This was about survival. She remembered the threat, Maya's voice, cool and venomous, whispering promises of harm in her ear just seconds before everything went black. And now, Layla's only mission was to protect her child. Across town, Jordan stood in the ballroom of his estate, the same one where Maya now played hostess, basking in the praise of society elites. The annual charity gala was underway, glittering with opulence and false smiles. Maya shone at the center of it all, camera flashes bouncing off her gown like she was royalty. But tonight, Jordan had a plan. Every movement he made was deliberate. Every conversation, every polite smile, staged. He signaled his assistant. The projector lit up. The room dimmed, the noise settled, and the footage began. The room watched in silence as the video played, unedited, unforgiving. Layla's fall, the scream, the twist of her body in midair. But before that, the balcony shot. Maya inches away from Layla, Maya reaching forward. The footage paused. Gasps filled the ballroom. She pushed her, someone said. No, did she? Another whispered. Maya turned pale. The room turned into a courtroom. She backed away, her mask cracking in real time. But before she could escape, Jordan stepped forward and caught her by the wrist. "You're not leaving," he said quietly. "Not until this is finished." Maya panicked, hissed through clenched teeth. "I gave you everything." Jordan's voice was steel. "You took everything." She twisted in his grip, but there was no getting out. Guards approached. The guests circled in, whispering, some filming, but Jordan raised a hand. "I'll deal with her myself." They gave him space, and in that moment, something shifted. The queen who had ruled his world with deception now stood exposed in front of everyone who once adored her. But it wasn't the footage that sealed her fate. It was the voice that cut through the tension like a blade. Layla. She walked in slowly, her steps fragile but full of fire. And when her eyes met Maya's, the air snapped with electricity. "You didn't just want to destroy me," Layla said, her voice steady. "You wanted to become me." Jordan's heart cracked open. But the night wasn't over. The real reckoning had just begun. The ballroom stood still, frozen in the tension between. Three people who had once shared secrets, dinners, and dreams. Now they stood on opposite ends of a truth so dark, even the glittering chandeliers couldn't soften it. Layla didn't break eye contact. Her gown was plain, her hair still damp from recovery, but she looked more powerful than ever. Not because of what she wore, but because she was standing. "You let her move into our home," she said, not even looking at Jordan. Her eyes stayed locked on Maya. "Into our lives, our child's future." "And for what?" Maya smirked, but her voice trembled. "Because you stole from me first." Layla didn't flinch. "I didn't steal anyone. He chose me." "That's not how I remember it," Maya snapped. "No," Layla replied calmly, "because your memory only sees what it wants to." Jordan felt like a bystander in his own life. The words tossed between them carried years of pain, confusion, and betrayal. But nothing hit harder than Layla's final sentence to Maya. "You wanted revenge so badly. You forgot you were destroying yourself in the process." That's when the police entered. The timing was no coincidence. Jordan had made sure of it. The lead detective stepped forward, a warrant in hand. "Maya Turner, you are under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and obstruction of justice." Maya didn't struggle. She just lowered her head, the weight of her secrets finally too much to hold. As the officers cuffed her and led her out, the camera flashes went wild. Reporters were already screaming headlines. Investors were walking out of the ballroom mid-sentence. The foundation Jordan had built over a decade was unraveling right there, between marble floors and golden railings. But he didn't care. He had chosen this. His mother rushed toward him, panic on her face. "Jordan, do you have any idea what you've done? This will destroy everything your father built." Layla stepped between them. "Maybe it should." The words landed like a slap. His mother's lips trembled. Then she turned and walked away, not bothering to hide her tears. Layla turned back to Jordan. Her voice softened. This wasn't about saving the company. It was about saving what little was left of you. He looked at her, unsure of how to respond. All the power he had once possessed felt useless now. He couldn't fix what he'd broken. He couldn't undo the pain. But what he could do was tell the truth, and he had. The headlines the next day were brutal. Billionaire exposes mistress in murder plot. Leaked footage shows shocking truth. Wealth, lies, and one woman's fall. The company's stock tanked. Lawsuits began piling up. Alan had disappeared with a portion of the assets before authorities could freeze his accounts. There were rumors he'd left the country under a false identity. The empire Jordan built was bleeding, and in many ways, so was he. But something unexpected emerged from the wreckage. Relief. For the first time in years, he didn't have to pretend. The lies were gone. The deception exposed. The woman who haunted his life from the inside was now behind bars, and Layla, though scarred, was still standing. He visited her at the hospital weeks later, not with roses, not with apologies, with silence. She didn't send him away. Their conversations were short, honest. No more games, no promises, just the truth. "I'm not here to fix us," he told her once. "I know I might not deserve that, but I want to be a father. If you'll let me." Layla watched him closely. "You were part of what broke me, but maybe you can help rebuild something else." She didn't give him answers. She gave him time. And with that time, Jordan changed. He handed over the house, the assets, and more than half of his fortune. Layla refused most of it, except for one thing: the foundation. The one Maya had nearly stolen, the one meant to help women and children. Under Layla's control, it became something real. Not just a vanity project with her name etched in gold. It became a sanctuary. She didn't decorate the office with awards or expensive art. She filled it with photos of survivors, with letters from shelters, with files that told stories just like hers, women betrayed, used, and left to rebuild. She didn't want revenge anymore. She wanted impact. Meanwhile, Maya's trial shook the city. Her web of lies, fraud, identity theft, and calculated manipulation became the centerpiece of nightly news. She sat in court with her lawyer whispering at her side, but her eyes never met the crowd again. The once fearless woman was now just a story. Another criminal headline. She was sentenced to 15 years. Alan, tracked down at a remote airport on the edge of the Caribbean, was arrested trying to flee with over $10 million in cash and digital assets. His face was splashed across media outlets as the billionaire traitor. No tears, no final statement, just the flash of cuffs and shame. Layla watched the coverage quietly from her living room, a cup of tea in hand and her child asleep nearby. There was no joy in their downfall, just closure. Justice had done what it could, but could justice ever really erase the pain? That question lingered. Jordan, stripped of status and wealth, now lived in a modest home far from the estate. He wrote letters, dozens, most of which he never sent, some filled with regret, some with hope, all of them unanswered. Then one afternoon she came to him. No makeup, no entourage, just herself and their son. "He should know you," she said quietly. "He deserves the truth." Jordan looked at the boy, unsure whether to smile or cry. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the start of something honest. The boy didn't speak much that first day, just stared at Jordan with wide, curious eyes that mirrored Layla's. Jordan didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to silence meaning something. But in that small moment, watching his son trace lines on the living room carpet, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Fragile, uncertain, but real. Layla didn't stay long. She wasn't there to play house or rewrite their past. She was there for her son, to give him answers, to give Jordan a chance, not at reconciliation, but at redemption. Over the next few weeks, Jordan started showing up. At daycare pickups, pediatric checkups, quiet visits at the park, not as a hero, just as a man trying to make things right. He brought no gifts, just presence. And slowly, Layla allowed it, not because she trusted him, not because she'd forgotten, but because their son deserved a father, even a broken one. Their conversations were still cautious, sometimes stiff. The air between them thick with history, but for every tense silence there was a shared glance, a brief moment of understanding, a memory that refused to rot. One day, as they stood on a beach watching their son chase seagulls, Layla spoke without, looking at him. "You know he still flinches when someone raises their voice." Jordan's throat tightened. "And sometimes," she continued, "he'll wake up crying, not from dreams, just memories he doesn't know how to name." Jordan could barely breathe. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Layla nodded. "I know." But she didn't say she forgave him, because forgiveness isn't owed, it's earned. Still, something had shifted. She had invited him in, not to their past, but to their present. It wasn't much, but for Jordan it was everything. Back at the foundation, Layla was building something that would outlast all of them. She had restructured the entire organization. No more board members who smiled in public but whispered in private. No more glossy events with meaningless speeches. This was now a place for action. She hired survivors, gave internships to women rebuilding after abuse, partnered with shelters in low-income communities, launched programs for teen mothers and women escaping toxic relationships. She turned her pain into fuel, her trauma into architecture, and people noticed. Not the tabloids or the elites, the right people, the ones who needed help, the ones who saw her not as a socialite or a fallen wife, but as a leader. Her story inspired thousands, yet she rarely spoke about it publicly. She didn't need to. Her work was loud enough. Meanwhile, Maya sat behind bars in a medium security facility. Her cell was plain, her days monotonous. The outside world no longer cared about her headlines. She wasn't glamorous anymore. She was forgotten, but Maya hadn't let go. She wrote letters too, dozens. Some addressed to Jordan, some to Layla. All of them returned unopened. She begged for understanding, claimed she'd been pushed too far, blamed trauma, heartbreak, loneliness. But there was one letter that stood out, the one she never sent. In it she admitted everything, not just the jealousy, not just the lies, but the hatred. The moment she stood on that balcony and saw Layla turn to face her, the power she felt, the momentary rush when she reached forward and pushed, not with force, but with intention. It was the one honest thing Maya had written in years, and she buried it in the back of a novel in the prison library. Maybe one day someone would read it, but it wouldn't change anything. Back in the city, Jordan's name was quietly returning to public spaces, not with celebration, but with quiet respect. He had refused offers for interviews, turned down lucrative book deals. He didn't want to profit from the pain. Instead, he volunteered. He spoke to young men about responsibility, respect, and choices. He told them the truth. That power doesn't make you a man, and silence can destroy more than any weapon. He worked behind the scenes with Layla's foundation, never asking for credit, just helping where he could. Slowly, Layla began to see a new version of the man she had once loved. One evening, after a long board meeting, they shared a ride home. There, son had fallen asleep in the back seat. "You've changed," she said, barely above a whisper. "I had to," Jordan replied. "Otherwise, I would have become her." Layla looked out the window. Maybe that's the point of all this. Maybe the real punishment isn't prison. It's having to face yourself. They rode the rest of the way in silence. That night, Jordan stood outside her door, their sleeping child in his arms, As he handed the boy to her, their hands touched. For the first time in a long time, it didn't burn. And that's when Layla finally said it. "Thank you for not giving up." Jordan nodded. "I'm not done yet." And he meant it, because redemption wasn't a single act, it was a lifetime of them. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly started to take shape again. Not as it once was, but as something entirely new. Layla still kept her walls up, but they weren't as high anymore. Jordan was never invited in, not fully, but he was no longer standing outside in the cold either. They had found a rhythm, co-parents, quiet partners in a messy, unfinished story. Layla's foundation flourished. She launched a new initiative called Second Voice, a program that trained survivors to become advocates and speakers. Women who had once been silenced were now leading workshops, standing behind podiums, and facing the very systems that failed them. Meanwhile, Jordan continued to work behind the scenes. He never asked for attention, never tried to reclaim the spotlight. He donated quietly, mentored volunteers, and helped reform the board from the shadows. Some days they barely spoke. Other days, a glance said more than a paragraph ever could. Then came the anniversary, 1 year since the night on the balcony. Layla didn't want to mark it. She didn't want a vigil or a speech. But something in her shifted when she saw a young girl, barely 20, walk into the foundation with bruises hidden under a scarf and a baby on her hip. That night, Layla sat at her desk, staring at the city lights. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then texted Jordan. "There's going to be a gala, one night, no press, just impact," Jordan replied in under 10 seconds. "I'll be there." They hosted it in the same ballroom where Maya once smiled for cameras. But this time there were no champagne towers, no string quartets, just chairs, lights, and stories. Survivors stood up one by one and told their truth. No filters, no fear. When Layla finally took the mic, the room went silent. "I didn't come here tonight to talk about what happened to me," she began. "You already know that story. What I want to talk about is what didn't happen. No one caught me when I fell. No one warned me when I was being replaced. And for too long, I blamed myself for not seeing it. But the truth is, when women speak, we're often heard too late." She paused, looked out over the crowd. "But tonight, we're being heard in real time." Applause erupted, not loud or performative, but real. When the gala ended, Jordan found her by the stage. "You didn't just reclaim your voice," he said. "You gave it away to people who needed it more." Layla smiled, tired but at peace. That's what power's for, not to keep, to pass on. They stood there a moment longer. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who had been through hell and chose not to let it define them. The next day, Jordan received a package at his door. Inside was a photo. It was Layla, holding their son, standing in front of the foundation's new mural, a towering piece of art that read, "We rise, we speak, we stay." There was a sticky note attached, "For his room, so he knows where he comes from." Jordan didn't cry. He just stood there, holding the picture, letting the silence settle. Across town, Layla watched a new intern give her first tour of the facility. She smiled. The girl's voice shook at first, but gained strength with every sentence. That's when Layla knew she'd done something that would outlive the scandal, the headlines, even her name. Back in prison, Maya's world had shrunk to concrete walls and steel doors. The headlines had faded. The letters stopped coming. She was no longer a name people whispered at galas or feared in courtrooms. She was forgotten. One afternoon, she heard her name over the intercom. A visitor. Her heart jumped, but it wasn't Jordan. It wasn't Layla. It was a reporter. "You used to own the room," he said as he sat across from her. Maya leaned back, arms crossed. "So?" So what happened? She tilted her head, smirking. The wrong woman lived. He raised an eyebrow. That's your takeaway. She leaned forward, her smile sharp. I never cared about being caught. I cared about winning, and if I couldn't win, then I'd rather burn the board. The reporter closed his notebook. You got your wish. Everything's ashes now. Maya's eyes darkened. That's where rebirth starts, doesn't it? But even she didn't believe it. Back in the city, Layla's story was being taught in university law classes. Her foundation received federal grants. Survivors across the country wrote to her, thanking her for showing them that survival didn't have to be silent. And Jordan, he was still showing up, every parent-teacher night, every scraped knee, every night their son couldn't sleep. He didn't ask for anything back. He just stayed. One night, after their son fell asleep on the couch watching cartoons, Layla covered him with a blanket. Jordan helped quietly, then turned to leave. Stay for a bit? She asked softly. He paused, then sat down beside her. No promises, no vows, just a shared silence that didn't feel like distance anymore. The living room was quiet, except for the low hum of the television. Their son lay curled up on the couch, a soft blanket over him, his tiny breaths rising and falling in rhythm. Layla sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze somewhere between the screen and her own thoughts. Jordan sat across from her, unsure if he should speak or just sit with the silence. This was the most peace they'd shared in years, and somehow it was heavier than their worst fights. You ever wonder, she asked suddenly, what we could have been if none of it had happened? Jordan looked down. All the time. But then I think, maybe that was the problem, Layla said. We were too sure it couldn't fall apart. Jordan didn't argue. He couldn't. She was right. The truth was, they'd built something beautiful but fragile, and someone like Maya didn't break things. She just waited until the cracks were wide enough. I keep asking myself if I ignored the signs, Layla whispered. Was I too trusting, too naive? Jordan shook his head. You weren't the one who brought her in. I was. That doesn't mean I didn't welcome her, she replied. I opened the door. Jordan leaned forward. And she walked through it wearing a mask no one could have seen through. That's not your fault, Layla. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on their son. Still feels like I failed him. No, Jordan said firmly. You protected him, you survived, and you're raising him with strength I never had. She glanced at him. You're here now. I wasn't when it mattered, he said. But I'm trying. That night Jordan didn't sleep in the guest room. He didn't stay at all. But as he left, Layla didn't close the door behind him immediately. She watched him walk to his car, her heart tangled in threads of memory and reality. Was she ready to let go of the past? Or just strong enough now to face it without breaking? Weeks passed. Their co-parenting grew into something more fluid, less formal. They still lived apart, still walked separate paths. But their intersections were no longer tense. They were warm, familiar. One Saturday morning, their son ran into Jordan's arms after a soccer game, screaming, "We won! Dad, we won!" Jordan scooped him up, laughing. Layla stood nearby, smiling faintly, watching a version of Jordan she had almost forgotten existed. She didn't love him the same way anymore, that was clear. But there was something new growing, rooted in resilience, respect, and something else she hadn't expected to feel again. Trust. And then came the invitation. The National Women's Alliance requested Layla to keynote their annual summit. It was the biggest platform she'd ever been offered. Government officials, lawmakers, educators, all in attendance. She almost declined. Public speeches weren't her comfort zone, but Jordan encouraged her. Tell your story, he said. Not for you, for the ones still living in it. So she did. The stage was massive, the lights intimidating. But when Layla spoke, the entire room leaned in. I survived a betrayal that nearly ended my life. But that's not the story I'm here to tell, she began. Because survival isn't the end, it's the beginning. She spoke of strength, of learning to live without the approval of those who broke her, of rebuilding from rubble, of raising a child not on fear, but on truth. "I am not the woman I was before," she said near the end, "and that's the greatest gift pain ever gave me." The audience rose in applause, tears, cheers, recognition. Afterward, Jordan met her backstage. He didn't say anything, just looked at her like she was the most powerful person he'd ever seen. "You didn't just speak," he said finally. "You made them feel seen." Layla looked down at her hands. "That's all I've ever wanted. For someone to see the woman I've become, not the one they left behind." He didn't try to touch her, didn't ask for anything. He just stood beside her, and in that moment, she didn't feel alone. That night, as she tucked their son into bed, he looked up at her and asked, "Mom, are we gonna live with Dad again someday?" She paused. "Maybe, maybe not. But he'll always be around, okay? Always." The boy nodded, satisfied. "Okay." Outside, Jordan stood in the hallway, having heard every word. He didn't knock, didn't interrupt. He just smiled, turned, and walked back to the guest room with a full heart and no expectations. Across the city, headlines shifted. The focus wasn't on scandal anymore. It was on change. Layla's foundation was now working with 3 state programs, helping to draft policy reforms for victims of coercive abuse. Survivors who once lived in silence were now being empowered to change the very systems that failed them. Maya, in her prison cell, heard about it through a folded-up newspaper passed along from another inmate. She scoffed. "They turned her into a saint," she muttered. The inmate shrugged. "You tried to kill her. What did you think would happen?" Maya didn't answer. She turned away from the light, her world growing smaller every day. But for Layla, the light had never been brighter. 1 year after the fall, the Foundation's headquarters opened a new wing, a recovery center named Layla's Haven. It was designed for women and children escaping violence, some physically wounded, others emotionally shattered. But all of them needed a place to begin again. The opening was quiet. No red carpet, no cameras, just a soft ribbon cut by a woman who once lay broken on a marble floor, now standing firm on her own terms. Layla didn't invite celebrities. She invited survivors. One by one, women stepped into the new wing, some carrying toddlers, some carrying trauma. All of them were greeted by someone who understood not just what they'd been through, but what it meant to rebuild from it. Jordan stood off to the side during the event, watching. He didn't belong at the center of the spotlight anymore, and he didn't want to. This wasn't his victory, it was hers. Later that night, after the last guest had gone, Layla and Jordan sat alone in her office. Their son had fallen asleep on the couch again, curled up with a worn stuffed bear. "You changed this place," Jordan said, motioning around them. "No," she replied softly. "I just gave it a purpose." Jordan nodded. "So what now?" She looked at him, really looked at him. "Now we live, not for the past, not for guilt, just for now." He leaned back. "Think we'll ever be us again?" She gave a faint smile. "I think we already are. Just a different version." And that was enough. Outside the city, Maya sat in a cramped visiting room with her court-appointed therapist. Her sentence was long, but parole might come early with good behavior. She rarely spoke during sessions, but today she said something that caught the therapist off guard. "She forgave him, you know," Maya muttered, eyes on the scratched tabletop. "Not me, but him." The therapist tilted her head. "Does that bother you?" Maya gave a tight smile. No, that was always her strength. "She survived me." She stood, pushing her chair back. "People like her, they burn slow. But when they rise, you feel the heat from miles away." And with that, she walked out. Back in the city, Layla tucked her son into bed. The boy had drawn a crayon picture earlier that day. It was simple. 3 stick figures on a beach, holding hands beneath a sun with long yellow rays. He had labeled them in uneven handwriting, Mom, Me, and Dad. She stared at it a long while before pinning it to the fridge. In the months that followed, Layla gave fewer speeches and did more fieldwork. She spent time with victims, worked on legislative reform, and helped restructure foster care access for domestic abuse survivors. Her name quietly appeared in grant letters and Senate panels. She didn't need credit. She wanted results. Jordan kept his distance from the press, but stayed close to his son. Soccer games, school plays, awkward. Science projects, they did it all. Sometimes with Layla, sometimes on his own. The tension between him and Layla faded into something simple and human. A shared history and a child who grounded them both. One evening their son asked, "Were you two always friends?" Layla glanced at Jordan, then smiled. "Not always, but the best friendships are the ones that survive the fire." At the beach, a place they visited often now, the 3 of them walked barefoot in the surf. No cameras, no drama, just sand, water, and the slow healing of time. Jordan reached for Layla's hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold. On either, she simply walked beside him, not as his wife, not as his enemy, but as something stronger. In the end, it wasn't revenge that defined them. It wasn't betrayal or scandal or loss. It was what came after. The quiet strength, the choice to rebuild instead of retreat, the decision to rise when staying broken might have been easier, and sometimes that's the greatest kind of love. A kind that doesn't need a label. The kind that lets you go, but still walks beside you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know your favorite moment in the comments.